Hey everybody, I'm Phantom, and today I am going to be talking about death. Elden Ring has many subcategories of spells, incantations, weapons, talismans, everything you could possibly think of. The amount of work that FromSoft put into making a very large variety of these subcategories is astounding. This leads to a great amount of niche builds that can build around pretty much one or two specific stats, an ailment, or one of the aforementioned categories. There's Faith Madness builds that use Vike's Spear, there's Sleep Intelligence builds that use St. Trina's Sword, but in terms of death spells, much like with the Dragon incantations and Frenzy incantations, there is one staff that boosts them by a flat amount. That is the Prince of Death's Staff. This is a sorcery staff that scales off of both Intelligence and Faith collectively, allowing you to put points into both to greatly boost the spells you cast with it, along with the flat percentage boost that I talked about to all the spells categorized as death spells. Which brings us to the first of many problems with death spells. The staff scales off of Faith and Intelligence at the same time, which means ideally, you would want a weapon that does so as well. It would only make sense. If you have to dedicate so many levels to the staff, you don't want to waste them by using a weapon that doesn't benefit from them. However, there is only one weapon in Elden Ring that scales off of Intelligence and Faith at the same time. The Sword of Night and Flame. Why is this a problem? Well, not only is the Sword of Night and Flame a nerfed sword, but it has nothing to do with death spells or death blight, unlike the other subcategory weapons like Vike's Spear or Trina's Sword. Feeling like I'm kind of being forced to use a nerfed straight sword that uses magic damage and fire damage instead of the death stuff that I wanted to build my build around, I immediately went to my TikTok and I asked you guys if you knew anything else that I could possibly do. And thanks to your guys' ideas, I was able to dig around, read a lot of weapon descriptions, interactions with spells, and figure something out. Now I have to show you the second problem with death spells. They are all over the place. They are not just all over the place, but they are as far apart from each other as they could possibly go. There are actually 3 completely different death spell categories that get boosted by the Prince of Death's Staff. There is the Death Incantation, the Deathrite spells, and the Death Blight spell. This means that essentially you have a grand total of 3 different ways you can do a death build effectively. However, all 3 are almost entirely separate from one another, meaning you can't just use the whole category. You get 1 or 2 spells and a weapon, and that's it. I'm going to show you guys the simpler 2 first, so then I can afterwards talk a little bit more about the third one that I am very excited to share with you guys. The first death build is a Death Blight build. This build features the only weapon in Elden Ring that causes Death Blight buildup, a Faith-only curved sword called the Eclipse Shuttle. Sadly, this weapon's Death Blight buildup is very slow, and in PvP higher than level 100, fights will almost always be done with before you can fill up a bar. Either you're going to 4-shot them, or they're going to 4-shot you, sometimes even 1-shot you. Having Faith be the preliminary stat, you would bring with you the Erdtree Seal, which is the best Faith scaling seal, and the only Death Blight incantation, Death Lightning. This build in of itself is alright. You can do decent damage, and on the off chance you actually hit someone with the lightning, you can make pretty quick work of them. It's one of the only ways that you can actually build up the Death Blight, is getting them to run through the smoke that the Death Lightning leaves behind. The second death build has more options for weapons, as it prioritizes intelligence instead of faith, allowing you to use many different Deathrite weapons, such as the Death's Poker, Helfin Steeple, and the Death Ritual Spear, all of which are fantastic weapons. This build uses Deathrite spells, which require mostly intelligence but a small bit of faith, making the Prince of Death's Staff more usable, seeing as how it can use the faith to boost the Deathrite spells even further than they're already boosted just by having them be considered death spells. The Deathrite spell with the highest faith requirement is Explosive Ghost Flame, with a pretty simple 30 faith requirement, meaning you would want to at least hit that mark to be able to use the best Deathrite spell that there is, and you wouldn't have to go that far to use the others, such as Ancient Death Rancor. But something you'll notice, while both of these aforementioned builds are not bad by any means, they do not use the Prince of Death's Staff to its greatest potential, and unless you level your faith to a certain point, the staff will just be flat out scaled by other staves and other seals, meaning there really is no point in using it. So how can we make a death-based build that can actually use Fia's Mist, the only Deathblight spell that requires a massive 23 intelligence to use? How can we get these stats without being shoehorned and being forced into using the Sword of Night and Flame? Well, thanks to a few of you in my TikTok comment section, I was told about one weapon that can be given scaling in intelligence and faith through adding a weapon art to it. And subsequently, I did more digging and found a second weapon as well. These two weapons are the Erdtree Dagger and the Clayman's Harpoon. And these are the only two weapons in Elden Ring that have default faith or int scaling, but can be given weapon arts, allowing you to give them the Sacred, Sacred Flame, or Magic Augment, giving them a 4th scaling. For example, if I take this Erdsteel Dagger, it has a flat, basic faith scaling. And if I were to come down here and give it an intelligence-based spell, it would also be given an intelligence scaling. Whatever scaling you give to the weapon will be higher than the other one. However, it is a way to get a different weapon than the Sword of Night and Flame that has scalings in both intelligence and faith, and you can kind of choose which weapon art you use using any of the default weapon arts that allow you to go into Magic, Flame Art, or Sacred, or being able to use a magical one that you like, or even using a faith one that you like. Whichever floats your boat. It gives you options, which is all I wanted. This alone is pretty good. However, there is one more option I found. To my knowledge, nobody has discovered this yet, and I have been unable to find anyone talking about it, meaning I might actually be able to blow your mind with this. When you add an augment to a weapon, it gains a scaling. However, the trade-off is that you cannot buff the weapon. You can't use spells, incantations, or consumables that apply a damage type to the weapon. This is the same for all weapons that cannot be given a weapon art, except for one. See, if I were to take a sword, like I was saying, like the Coated Sword, which has a flat faith scaling, and I try to use Scholar's Augment on it, it won't let me. If I have a sword that's just a normal sword, then I can do it easy. But one weapon is different. One weapon allows you to buff it, even though you cannot give it a weapon art. Not only that, but we are lucky enough that it also has default scaling in faith. The weapon I am talking about is the Tree Spear. The Tree Spear is a great spear type weapon that has a half-decent scaling with faith, along with relatively tame attribute requirements that really aren't much more than that of what the Sword of Night and Flame would require in the first place. On top of that, like I said, you can buff it. That means that you can get all the benefits of your full faith scaling, and then use an intelligence scaling weapon buff to get some substantial damage on it. The one big trade-off to this is that you do not get a weapon art that you can use. Seeing as how you cannot change the weapon art, the Tree Spear's only weapon art that it comes with is Sacred Order, and if you were to use Sacred Order, it would remove the weapon buff you added to give it holy damage. Pretty good against the bosses who are weak to it, but in PvP, it's not that great. And sadly, no matter which order you do it in, you cannot put both buffs on the weapon. Whichever buff you use last will replace the buff you use first. However, if you put a shield that has a parry or shove, or a staff that has a special weapon art, you can forget about the Sacred Order weapon art and focus on hitting them with the spear. This is great for two reasons. The first is that great spears are some of the strongest weapons in the game. They have fantastic roll catch abilities, they can be buffed with the thrusting talisman, and with the right staff, you can get a shitload of bonus damage onto this thing. Like, really good bonus damage. I had to do a lot of testing and research to figure out what would work best, and I found out some more really weird but good to know information about weapon buffs in Elden Ring. If you have a staff or seal that scales off of 2 or more stats, such as the Prince of Death's staff, or if I were to go over here and look at the Golden Order seal, well, the items have attribute scaling and intelligence and faith. If you use the Golden Order seal to do a buffing incantation, or the Prince of Death staff to do a buffing spell, it will only use the stat associated with the spell type. So if you use a spell buff, it will only use the intelligence scaling that it has. And if you use an incantation buff, it will only use the faith scaling that it has. So ideally, the optimal thing you would want to do with this build is to obviously have the Prince of Death staff here for your death spells, have the Golden Order seal here for your death lightning, but then for a third thing, you would want to take a really high scaling intelligence staff that you can dedicate just for the buff. The higher the int scaling on the staff, the stronger the buff will be. Considering we are only going to be using the staff for the weapon buff, I found that the best possible staff is Lusat's Glintstone Staff. Not only does it boast an extremely high intelligence scaling, but it also enhances the power of all sorceries cast with it. But it consumes additional FP, which won't be a problem for us because the only spell we're going to be casting with it is the weapon buff itself. However, there's one more thing that I quickly need to point out before we get on to the next part and look at the numbers. The Phlox Canvas Talisman and the Graven Mask Talisman are talismans that boost the potency of sorceries and incantations. These do not affect your weapon buff. If you do a spell weapon buff with the Graven Mask Talisman, it will not do more damage. And if you do an incantation weapon buff with the Phlox Canvas Talisman, it will not do more damage. Taking these might be useful for the other spells, but it will not net you a bonus damage on your weapon itself. Just another of the handful of weird spell buff interactions that I found out while doing all the research that I did in order to make this build and make this video. You have to dedicate some decent levels to be able to use all of this to its fullest. Ideally, you want as much vigor as you can possibly get. On top of that, you need at least 60 faith and intelligence in order to get your Prince of Death staff and your Order seal to have a sorcery scaling high enough that it's actually more worth it than using a really high scaling intelligence or a really high scaling faith staff or seal. You also need to put a few points into strength and dex, which can be slightly mitigated by using talismans such as Radigan Swordsteel. You can also use the Great Hood. This gives you +2 to intelligence and +2 to faith at the same time, giving you essentially 4 levels worth of points at the cost of a tiny bit of health being reduced, but you can practically replace that health being reduced with an Erd Tree Blessing +1 or 2, or even better, a +2 Crimson Medallion, which will more than replace it. So the ideal build would look something along these lines. If you look at my stats, I am currently using the Great Hood to get +2 in intelligence and faith. I am also using Radigan Swordsteel to top off my health, give me a little extra endurance, be able to fulfill my strength and dex requirements for the Great Spear, and then Marika's Swordsteel for 5 points into mind to be able to cast more spells, and then 5 points into faith and intelligence to get that better. Together, these do make you take a little bit more damage. However, it gives you so many levels that are needed in order to really optimize this build. But let's compare these 4 weapons and see what we can come up with. So starting with the Sword of Night and Flame, right now we are sitting at about 724 flat damage. This is split over physical, magic, and fire. It's pretty decent damage. Like, that's pretty good damage. And yes, that is also because we have a lot of points. Our character is level 150 right now. So it does require a lot of points to get it this strong, but you can get it that strong. The follow-up is the Magic Erdsteel Dagger. Seeing as how the faith scaling was lowered at a decent amount by the fact that we used a weapon art to put intelligence on it, it doesn't do that much damage, but 422 damage on 2 damage types on a dagger that attacks as fast as it does, that is not bad at all. That is not bad at all, and that is definitely something that you can use. Plus, it has the increased critical, so if you were to put a parrying shield in the offhand instead of one of the things I mentioned before, you could definitely make good use of that. The third weapon is the Clayman's Harpoon, given the flame art with Sacred Fire so that it gets a B scaling in faith. That sits at about 690, which is not too far off. Not too far off from the Sword of Night and Flame. It does the same 3 damage types. I wouldn't say it's quite as good as the Sword of Night and Flame, but it is a spear. And you can put 2 spears, you could dual wield these if you really wanted to. You don't have to use buffs to keep them strong. You get to use whatever weapon art you put on it, and you get to use the Spear Talisman. So it is definitely a very strong choice. Having looked at these, let's now compare the strongest one to the Tree Spear. Standalone, the Tree Spear has about 663 damage without the buff. It's just lacking underneath the Sword of Night and Flame. Not too crazy bad, but it is lacking there. Let's throw on our 3 casting increments using the Prince of Death Staff, the Golden Order, and of course, like I said, Lusat's Glintstone Staff. So let's pop Scholar's Armament onto this weapon and see what it's looking like. 899 damage. That is almost 200 more damage. To top it off, it is a spear that can have the Spear Talisman, giving it even more damage on counterattacks, and it's a great spear, so it has fantastic roll catching. The only thing, like I said, is it doesn't have a weapon art. If you cast Sacred Order, it gets rid of the original thing. It does do a flat damage boost, however that flat damage boost is not enough to get the spear even remotely close to where it is using this. 900 damage is not something to scoff at. If I two-hand it, there we go, 912 damage. That's pretty damn good, if I do say so. And you can also, like I said before, cast your double cast spells. Say you wanted to pop Death Lightning, pop over to your order, Death Lightning. This is by far the most optimal way to get damage out of building both intelligence and faith. I'm excited to see what I can get off with this. If you want to take part in my build crafting and PvP shenanigans, consider subscribing to this channel. Check me out on TikTok. Whenever I have something quick to show off, I post about it over there. I also ask questions so you guys can put your input in. But for now, I'm going to take the spear and let's go see exactly how much damage it can do. While I'm running over, I could also say, if you also wanted to kind of top things off, you can use a rune arc with Godric's rune in place of both of these source seals. If you don't like having the negative, it'll put the same amount of points into everything. It's just, obviously, if you're invading, you can't have your rune arc active, so it's only going to be something you can use as host. Another cool little interaction that you can do with this spear, it does both magic and holy damage once you buff it, and both the holy damage and the magic damage scorpion charms can be used to buff its damage even more. As long as you're willing to take that lowered damage negation, you can do that. Alright, let's do it. That leaves you very open for a very long time. GG. That was a good fight. You saw when I was able to land a counterattack, that did some pretty decent damage. And that was just the weapon. You can also use a bunch of different spells now that you have all this scaling. Stuff like Explosive Ghost Flame, Fuse Mist, Death Lightning, and even Ancient Death Rancor, which is a pretty good ability for putting pressure on the other people. I don't have it grabbed on this character, so I sadly can't really show it off. Hey. Alright. Let's play. Oh. Seppukuing, I'll give him a moment to seppuku. That shit hurted. GG. Duels at rune level 150 go by pretty fast. Either get 2-shot or you 2-shot. You can get this to work at lower levels, obviously, by going a little bit lower into an intelligence and faith setup and kind of not really putting so much into mind and relying on items like perhaps instead of using the Great Hood, you want to throw on the Perceptor's Big Hat or something like that just to get a couple more points into mind for your spells. But as you can see, this is more to show off the weapon. I could show off all the spells, but that's a completely different topic. The weapon is what I wanted to show off because I wanted to show you guys that there are other options besides just using the Sword of Night and Flame. Every single build using the Deathrite spells that I have seen uses that sword. Every single one of them without fail. And as great as that sword is and as fun as it can be, I like options. So I found some. And I hope that if you go out there and give them a try, you'll enjoy them as much as I have been. Because this spear, oh, I love this spear. It even has a cool moveset where if you hold your heavy, you do 2 stabs. And that catches a lot of people off. You can catch people mid-roll with it. If you want to take part in more build crafting stuff like this, like I said before, subscribe to my YouTube channel, go check out my TikTok where I ask questions, who knows. I hope you enjoyed this. Now go out there and make the most of your stats and start enjoying death builds a little bit more.